What if everything you thought you knew about the Dutton family tree was wrong, not just a little wrong, but completely broken? Because when you look closely at the Yellowstone timeline, one question keeps coming back louder than anything else: where did the missing generation go? We have fathers, sons, grandsons, names repeating, timelines crossing, stories connecting, but in between all of it, there's a gap so strange that even fans can't ignore it anymore. A full generation that simply doesn't line up the way it should. And the deeper you go into the Dutton bloodline, the more confusing it gets. Because this isn't just a family tree anymore, it's a puzzle with missing pieces. And today, we're finally breaking it all down. To understand where everything goes wrong, we have to start at the roots of the Dutton family line, the early generations that shaped everything we see in Yellowstone today. It all begins with the earliest settlers of the Dutton name, the generation introduced in the Yellowstone prequels, where survival wasn't just a struggle, it was the entire lifestyle. This is where the family tree is supposed to be simple, clear, straightforward. But it's not. Because from the very beginning, the story starts stacking generations in a way that doesn't fully connect. We move from the first generation into the second, where the family expands through hardship, loss, and survival. These are the names that build the foundation of the Yellowstone Ranch itself. Every decision, every death, every sacrifice, meant to secure the land for the future. But here's where things start to feel off. Instead of a clean, linear progression from one generation to the next, the timeline begins to split. Certain characters disappear without clear continuation. Others are introduced later in ways that don't perfectly align with the expected family order. And this is where fans started noticing something strange. The generations don't flow naturally, because after the early Duttons, we are introduced to a new wave of characters who are supposed to represent the next stage of the bloodline. But when you try to map them out, something doesn't match. Names repeat. Relationships overlap. And most importantly, there seems to be a gap where a full generation should exist, but doesn't clearly appear on screen. This is where the confusion around John Dutton's lineage becomes impossible to ignore. We are told about multiple Johns across different timelines, each belonging to different eras of the family. But when you try to place them in order, the structure starts to break apart. One John leads into another John, but the connection between them doesn't always follow the expected generational pattern. Instead of a clean father-to-son progression, we get missing links, skipped timelines, and unclear transitions between generations. And that's exactly where the mystery begins. Because if the family tree is supposed to move step by step, generation by generation, then where exactly did the missing one go? This is the question that changes everything. Because once you notice it, you can't unsee it. And as we move deeper into the Dutton timeline, the gaps only get bigger. And the answers get even more complicated. Now the confusion really starts to take shape when we focus on the most important name in the entire Yellowstone timeline. John Dutton. Because this is where the family tree should finally make sense. One clear line. One generation leading to the next. A simple father-to-son structure that ties everything together. But instead, what we get is something completely different, a chain of John Duttons that doesn't fully connect the way it's supposed to. We have multiple Johns across different timelines. Different eras. Different lives. But when you try to line them up in order, the structure starts to feel unstable, almost like pieces are missing between them. One version of John appears in the earlier timeline, raised in a world still being built from survival and land disputes. Another John comes later, shaping the modern Yellowstone we know today. And then there are references to Johns in between. But that between is exactly where the problem begins. Because the family tree suggests a smooth generational flow, yet what we actually see is a jump. A gap. A missing connection that never gets fully explained on screen. And this is where the so-called fourth generation problem comes in. Fans started noticing something strange when trying to map the Dutton lineage. If each John represents a new generation, then logically, there should be a clear fourth generation sitting between the early Dutton settlers and the modern-day ranch owner. But that generation doesn't clearly exist in the way people expect. Instead, we get characters whose timelines overlap, skip forward, or exist in side branches that don't fully connect back to the main line. It creates a structure that feels incomplete, like a missing bridge in the middle of a long road. And the more you examine it, the more questions appear. Who exactly belongs to the missing generation? Was it ever shown properly? Or was it intentionally left unclear to allow the story to expand in different directions through the prequels? Because Yellowstone doesn't tell its family history in a straight line. It tells it in fragments. Flashbacks. Prequels. Spin-offs. Each one filling a piece of the puzzle, but never showing the full picture at once. That's why the John Dutton line feels so confusing. It's not just one character. It's a repeating name across time, layered over generations that don't always connect cleanly. And this is where the theory begins to form. Maybe the missing generation isn't actually gone, maybe it's split across different stories. Hidden inside spin-offs. Or maybe it was never meant to be shown directly, only implied through the consequences of what came after. Because when a family tree stops making sense in a straight line, it usually means something happened in the middle that changed everything. And in Yellowstone, that middle might be exactly where the biggest secrets are hiding. This is where things stop being just confusing and start becoming a real mystery. Because once you accept that the Dutton family tree doesn't move in a clean straight line, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly happened to the generation that doesn't fully appear? In a normal family timeline, every generation should connect clearly. Parents lead to children, children become parents, and the pattern continues without gaps. But in Yellowstone, that pattern feels broken in the middle, like a chapter was skipped or rewritten after the fact. And this is where the idea of a missing generation begins to take shape. Some fans believe this missing link isn't one person, but an entire group of Dutton descendants who exist off-screen or only briefly mentioned across the different timelines. Characters who were born between major events but never fully explored in detail. A generation that lived, survived, and continued the bloodline, but was never given a full story of its own. Instead, their existence is only hinted at through later characters. Through names that repeat. Through unclear relationships. Through timelines that don't perfectly match when you try to align them step by step. And that's what makes this so frustrating to break down, because the show doesn't confirm it directly. It leaves space for interpretation. For example, when we look at the transition between the early Dutton settlers and the more modern versions of the family, there's a noticeable jump in structure. We go from survival-based generations to more established ranch leadership, almost like there was an entire developmental phase in between that isn't fully shown. That in-between is exactly where the missing generation is theorized to exist. A bridge generation that connects hardship to legacy. The group that would have stabilized the ranch, expanded the land, and carried the family forward before the modern Dutton era begins. But instead of being clearly defined, it's fragmented across different stories, hidden inside background references, and overshadowed by the more dramatic characters that follow. And that's where the confusion deepens even further. Because when fans try to place every John Dutton into a clean timeline, they run into contradictions. Some Johns seem too far apart in age gaps. Others appear in timelines that suggest there should be another generation in between them. But there isn't enough detail to confirm it. So the theory grows stronger, that the fourth generation isn't missing because it never existed, but because it was never shown as a complete unit. It was divided, scattered, and absorbed into different parts of the Yellowstone universe. And that changes everything. Because if the missing generation is real, then the entire family tree isn't just complicated, it's intentionally layered in a way that forces viewers to piece it together themselves. And as we move deeper, the biggest question still remains: if that generation exists in fragments, then who exactly belongs to it? And why was it never fully revealed? Now the Dutton family tree doesn't just feel confusing anymore, it starts to feel unstable. Because when you try to place every generation into a single straight timeline, something starts to collapse in the middle. The more you study it, the more you realize that the structure of the family isn't built like a simple ladder, it's built more like overlapping layers, where some pieces don't fully line up no matter how you arrange them. This becomes most obvious when you move from the early generations into the more modern Dutton era. At first, everything seems normal. The bloodline continues. The ranch is passed down. The name Dutton remains at the center of everything. But as the timeline progresses, the generational spacing starts to feel inconsistent. Some characters appear too close together in time to represent separate full generations, while others feel like they belong to a gap that is never properly explained. It creates a strange effect where the family tree looks complete on paper, but feels incomplete in practice. And that's where the idea of a broken timeline becomes important. Because Yellowstone doesn't always tell its story in chronological order. Instead, it moves between past and present, filling in emotional moments rather than strict generational structure. That storytelling style is powerful, but it also creates confusion when you try to map out the exact family order.